For the past few weeks, I've been experiencing some really strange and unsettling things in my house. I've lived here for 9 years, and nothing like this has ever happened before. But recently, it feels like something shifted. I hear strange noises, and I keep seeing shadows or movements in the corner of my eyes. Every time I look around, there's nothing there. It all started with a nightmare. I dreamt about a girl being beheaded. It was so vivid that I woke up in a panic. A few days later, I got into a taxi, and out of nowhere, the driver asked if I lived at the house in which he was picking me up from. When I said yes, he asked me if I knew what happened there. I didn't, so I asked him what he meant. He told me a woman had been beheaded in my front garden. As soon as he said that, I felt this deep, chilling sensation. It was like all the warmth in my body had disappeared. I later did some research and found out my house had been bombed during World War II and was later used as a safe house. The only part they fully repaired was the stairs. They concreted them, but the space underneath is still hollow. That area has always given me a strange feeling, but I've never paid too much attention to it until now. Since then, things have only gotten worse. The dreams have become more intense. I had one where a woman was standing in my hallway. She had long black hair, was barefoot, and wore a black dress. The most unsettling part was her smile. It was too wide and creepy. It was like she knew something I didn't. I woke up screaming, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The following night, I dreamt my house was on fire. The flames were everywhere and I couldn't escape. The next morning, my smoke alarm went off in the middle of the night. I checked the house. No smoke, no fire, but the alarm wouldn't stop. I eventually used a broom to turn it off, and 2 minutes later, it went off again. No explanation. The worst dream I had was about my dad. I saw him get into a car accident, and it felt so real that I woke up in a cold sweat. The next day I told him about it, and we joked it off as a bad dream. But then later that day, we actually got into a car accident. Thankfully, no one was seriously hurt, but the fact that it happened right after the dream freaked me out. Now at night, I keep seeing these things in the garden. Black, shadowy figures. They don't seem human, but they're there. They vanish as soon as I try to focus on them. And I know I'm not imagining it. Everything feels off, and it's getting harder to ignore. Growing up, I spent nearly every weekend at my grandparents' house. It was always such a warm and loving place, but there was something about it that just creeped me out, especially at night. Some of the rooms gave off this weird vibe, even during the day. There are two particular experiences that I had when I was younger. The first one happened when I was about 6. I was staying in my usual room, which had these old sliding wardrobes with noisy metal and glass doors. They always made this screeching sound when opened or closed. I'd eventually gotten used to it. One morning, at around 6 or 7, I was half asleep, and I heard the familiar screeching. I thought my grandma was just putting clothes away, so I casually glanced at the wardrobe. What I saw next completely freaked me out. There were 2 bony, gray hands with long nails. They were pulling the wardrobe door shut from the inside. I was so scared, I jumped out of bed and ran downstairs. My grandpa checked the wardrobe and found nothing unusual. But years later, after my grandpa passed away, my grandma told me that she had noticed some of the clothes were moved and a few had fallen off the hangers. It was like someone or something had been hiding in there. The second thing happened when I was about 13. I was coming down the stairs at my grandparents' house. That was when it felt a bit weird, kind of uneasy. I glanced over the banister and saw an old woman slowly walking toward the sitting room. In my half-asleep state, I thought it was my grandma. I called out, but she didn't respond. So I went to the sitting room to talk to her, but when I got to the room, it was empty. I looked around the house and couldn't find her anywhere. I eventually went outside and saw her way down in the garden, picking apples. The garden was massive, and unless she somehow sprinted down there and filled a bucket with apples in a couple minutes, there was no way she could have been in the house. When I asked if she had been inside, she said she'd been in the garden for over an hour. I was so confused and honestly a little spooked. Even now, these stories still freak me out when I think about them. Once I worked for an ambulance company, and we were leaving St. Bernardine's Hospital in the city of San Bernardino around 2 a.m. We were traveling northbound on Waterman. We had just crossed over Highland and were passing the cemetery north of the hospital. That was when I noticed someone crossing the street ahead of me in the dark, making their way towards the cemetery. My partner told me to look out and that someone was crossing. I acknowledged seeing the person, but as our headlights got closer to this individual, they vanished into thin air. Being the driver, I came to a complete stop in the middle of Waterman and looked over at my partner. I asked him if he saw what I saw, and he said yeah, that's why I was trying to tell you to slow down. I turned the ambulance floodlights on to the left, which were homes, and to the right, which was the cemetery, but nobody was seen. We both just shrugged it off and left. Either it was a ghost making its way back to the grave, or a homeless man. When I was 14, I had an encounter with a ghost, spirit, poltergeist, or something. Prior to this incident, I hadn't seen anything happen, and I haven't seen anything in my parents' house since. For some context, I grew up in a religious house where we did not believe in ghosts. The house I grew up in was old and would creak occasionally, but we always dismissed it as the house settling. My childhood cats would occasionally stare up at one of the corners of my bedroom. I always assumed it was just weird cat behavior and ignored it. Within the research I've done, there didn't seem to be any historical significance to the land my parents' house was built on, nor does it seem anyone died in my parents' house. Now, I know that just because I personally can't find anything does not mean that nothing has happened there. What I'm just saying is that I did my research. And now for the story. It was probably November, and I had spent the whole day cleaning and rearranging my room. As I was finishing up, a candle in a glass holder, think like a mini Bath & Body Works candle, slid off my desk and through the air and into my dresser. It traveled about a distance of 5.5 feet total. The candle and the glass broke into 2 or 3 pieces, and then my door slowly closed by itself. Obviously, I was freaked out and confused. I went and talked to my mom, who was in a separate part of the house. She suggested that it was a minor earthquake. Since the part of Illinois I grew up in, we had small quakes now and again. When I asked if she felt any movement, she said she hadn't. My mom suggested it could have been my brother pulling a prank on me, but he was downstairs and had no way of pulling such a prank. That was the only incident in that house, and I'm still confused as to what happened. I bring it up to my parents now and again, but they still have no explanation.